Hello, my name is Agnieszka Pikulicka-Wilczewska and this is Turan Tales, a podcast about Central Asia. It delves into stories of people, politics, social change and more, and is part of my newsletter which you can support on Substack. Welcome and be my guest in the journey to Central Asia. Hi listeners! In academia, in journalism, and sometimes in activist circles, we can still hear about the post-Soviet space. Things and places are described as post-Soviet if they had any connection with the Soviet Union or the vast territory that gained independence after its collapse, from Brest to Vladivostok, and from Arkhangelsk to the northern border of Iran. 35 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, is there anything that these places still have in common? Is the post-Soviet label still relevant? Or is it used to mark territories that, in Russia's view, are and should remain under its influence? What can we replace the post-Soviet label with? And, importantly, should we? This week, we're talking about the much-maligned but also much-overused concept of the post-Soviet. To unpack this term, we are joined by Erica Marat, a Washington, D.C.-based academic originally from Kyrgyzstan. Her research focuses on organized crime, violence, mobilization, and security institutions in Central Asia, North Asia, and Europe. She is the author of several books, most recently, Decolonial Disruptions in Central Asia, Discussion, Practices, and Networks, co-authored with Aizada Aristanbek. Welcome to Turan Talks. Hi, Erica. Thanks so much for being with us today.
Hi, Agnieszka. So happy to see you.
I am happy to see you too. What's the weather like in DC right now?
It's usual swamp-like weather, very hot, very humid, tons of mosquitoes. So,
yeah, I don't envy you. Like Almaty is bad, but not as bad.
I'll take dry heat any day to this humidity, sauna-like temperatures, yes.
Well, I hope you've got air conditioning at least, and that we'll be able to, finish this conversation. So today we'll be talking about the much hated word, post-Soviet. It is hated by loads of people dealing with Central Asia and especially by people dealing with decolonial issues. But it's also very often used. So just so we start, what do people usually mean when they say post-Soviet?
So it's a catch-all shorthand terminology often used by people residing outside of Central Asia, South Caucasus, Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, or the Baltic states. And it is often used in the West by academics and policymakers and just casual observers. And typically, it includes all the countries that used to be part of the Soviet regime, except Russia, and except the Baltic states. Baltic states, from the very beginning, turned to be Baltic states, and now that they are part of the EU and NATO, no one applies post-Soviet. Oh, rarely do journalists actually apply post-Soviet shorthand to them. But Central Asia, South Caucasus, and even Ukraine, that is fighting this existential war against Russia, is often labeled as post-Soviet, unfortunately.
So what is the problem with the term? Why people who live in the region, we are now talking about Central Asia, so why do people in Central Asia dislike this term so much?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin?
We've got time.
Yes. There's so many issues. First of all, post-Soviet means that somehow Central Asian countries are uniform in their development. There is nothing unique, and they are still linked to whatever happened to them in the 20th century. And it's been over 30 years since they became independent. The developments in those countries were interesting, dynamic, independent from whatever Russia was doing. And there are so many connections that Central Asian countries and societies, individuals were able to build all across the world. For instance, South Korean pop culture is popular in Central Asia. Turkey has a moment in Central Asia, or has been having a moment in Central Asia. There are Western influences, there are African influences, so many different influences that have nothing to do with whatever Stalin and Lenin had in mind for the region. So labeling any of the countries or all of the countries of Central Asia as post-Soviet makes no sense. And often that label is also used to not only reference Central Asia, but also Central Asia and the South Caucasus, for instance. So Central Asia, South Caucasus, and Ukraine, just because they were part of the same empire in the 20th century. And today, if we want to look at the developments there, it's a useful shorthand. But no one would use, for instance, post-British to label African countries, South Asian countries, or even United States of America. We never hear post-British United States of America when we talk about contemporary developments, because the British colonialism is so far in history and has such little influence in whatever is happening today, let's say, in South Africa or in India. So, yeah, it was the decolonial awakening in Central Asia. I think there is a more active pushback against this label as well.
Definitely there is. But for a moment, I wanted to play a devil's advocate because
yes.
I have been to almost all of the former Soviet republics. And when I think about them, there are common features still. It is architecture very often, architecture that shapes how populations develop, how they live, parks, for example, or the fact that, living quarters, residential quarters had everything next to them, right? Like a school and a kindergarten and poliklinika, right? A hospital. So in a way, I think especially if we're talking about people who grew up in the 90s, there is such a thing as post-Soviet upbringing. Because at least this is how I feel about these places. What I think about when I say post-Soviet is usually these kind of special conditions that were created after the collapse of the Soviet Union, which coincided with, economic collapse, complete economic change in those countries, kind of embracing capitalism and trying to build something on the shatters of the Soviet Union. And when I now live here in Central Asia, there's still this feeling of being post-Soviet, especially in Almaty. So I will ask you, what can be still called post-Soviet? Or do you ever use this term yourself?
Oh, full disclosure, I did use that term up until 2018. At the very least, when one of my books was published, was post-Soviet as part of the title. So, guilty as charged. Speaking about architecture, one of my European friends shared an observation that I found to be so hilarious. He said that every time he arrives into a city in Central Asia, in Russia, in the South Caucasus, so the countries that used to be occupied by the Soviet regime, he says that it feels like the city. There is a central train station, then there is the department store, Tsum or Gum, then there is a circus, then there is the Lenin Plaza or, square, and then there is Opera House. So it's this menu of Soviet creations, Soviet architecture is everywhere. And of course, the residential units. So that all, yes, it all remains. It's the infrastructure to, more or less in all the countries. And thankfully, Lenin statues have been replaced by other monuments. But yeah, what can you do with a large building that is a circus? you continue using it as a circus, right? Or a train station. Now, that said, if we go back to the 1990s, while the architecture remains, the hard, tangible architecture remains, I remember growing up as a school student in 1990s, and everything else collapsed. Utilities, schooling, public transport, obviously supply of food in grocery stores, jobs. It felt like everything just disintegrated overnight. And that was really scary. So I remember that period very well. It was quite traumatizing, to be honest. So that period was the post-Soviet moment. The 1990s was the post-Soviet moment. Since then, what the countries, the nations, societies were able to rebuild out of this destruction is not post-Soviet, is their unique pathways into what they are today. Obviously, not everyone is as wealthy as Kazakhstan or as glamorous as Almaty, but there has been an important effort in resilience and rebuilding since then that has nothing to do with the Soviet period, nothing to do with Russia, but very much to do with the very people who occupy those spaces and who built new meanings into what remains of Soviet architecture. So if you go to the same opera houses, you'll see different types of performances than what was propagandized during the Soviet period and used for the purposes of securing the Soviet regime. Today, it has different meanings in countries with more political openness like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, and now increasingly Uzbekistan. Those spaces are more spontaneous, more interesting, more contentious. There are many discussions about what they mean, how do we fill them with new meanings, and it has, again, nothing to do with the 20th century history and everything to do with the lived lives today.
Hey, quick little break. Thanks for listening to Turan Tales. We're a tiny independent show supported by listeners like you. If you like our work, you can get a paid subscription at turantales.substack.com/subscribe or buymeacoffee.com/turantales. Okay, back to the episode. What do you think? Who benefits from the continuous use of the term post-Soviet? Is it Russia? Because it still shows the connection between the region and Russia as this big brother who is still having some control over the region? Or is there maybe some sort of identity, a post-Soviet identity that is still here and that even some local people maybe don't want to break away from?
So I think when it comes to identity, and I'm going to answer the latter part of your question first. So when it comes to identity, yes, the older generations, they would often reference themselves as Soviet, not necessarily post-Soviet, but the Soviet who grew up, who became of age during the Soviet period. But even with that generation, was the Russified generation who was brought up during the Soviet period, there is a lot of soul-searching going on after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia. And they start to, I hear it again and again and again from family members, from friends of family, even from some of my students, that it's really, there is this questioning of everything they believed in during the Soviet period, whether it was valid based on what they see, what Russia is doing today in Ukraine, whether the Soviet period and Soviet Russia were the benevolent civilizers that Russia likes to present itself in Central Asia, especially that Russia civilized Central Asians into out of their backwards barbarian nomadic lifestyles. So that was the older generations. No one who was born in the later years of the Soviet period, myself included, or after the Soviet collapse, no one refers to themselves as post-Soviet. It's just strange. It's doesn't make any sense. It's awkward. How can you be post-Soviet? There is an article published by Central Asian Survey a few years ago. How can I be a post-Soviet if I was never Soviet? And of course, Russia loves that terminology because it does lost opportunity that Russia can really still claim its influence in Central Asia in particular and signal its entitlement over what happens in Central Asia and its entitlement to be influence the politics of Central Asia and identities of Central Asians as well. So the importance of the Russian language and admiration of Russia and all that stuff. It absolutely benefits Russia. One more thing, it also is unfortunately a shorthand with this political connotation that Russia is still the important power in the region, used by academics who see Russia as not necessarily a colonial power, but actually a power that civilized other nations. So kind of taking this racist view of Russia as a civilizing power in Central Asia, kind of that it actually did kind of save you and made you civilized, made you better off with the occupation as opposed to you deciding your own destiny. And for that school of thought, the post-Soviet label is true, it's neutral, and relevant still. So there is that as well in the academic world, unfortunately.
So do you think that the use of this label has somehow affected the national identity of Central Asian countries? Did it have any impact whatsoever on how people saw themselves?
So in the 1990s, and I would say 1990s, the first 20 years, yes, the label made somewhat sense in Central Asia. I think the conversations rejecting Soviet legacy and being labeled as post-Soviet and rejecting Russia as this benevolent big brother, the conversations started taking place pretty much in the end of actually during the Soviet period, more so towards the end, more so in the 1990s, 2000s. And then they really burst into the mainstream after the full-scale invasion in 2022 and Ukraine's resistance and the display of unimaginable Russian brutality in Ukraine. Those conversations really became dominant across Central Asia, how the type of violence that Russia is perpetrating in Ukraine was really the violence that Russia perpetrated in establishing the Soviet period and even a Soviet regime and even during the Tsarist Empire. So these conversations really are robust in Central Asia, as you yourself see it in Almaty. And post-Soviet, the label post-Soviet even is not it's not only meaningless at this point, but it can also be seen by Central Asian academics, activists, just general public as humiliating, as reductionist, kind of showing that Central Asians don't have their own agency in understanding history and building their own identity and their own civilization outside of Russian influence. So, yeah, it is a deeply negative term right now in Central Asia.
And what does it look like in academia? Because, well, we know that if we apply for grants, whether journalistic or academic, there are some keywords that donors like. And I have a feeling that post-Soviet space is one of them. So what does it look like in the academic world? Do you still feel that you somehow have to use this expression, or that maybe some grant-giving organizations want to put this region into this sort of box to limit it by using this term post-Soviet? Do you encounter that a lot in academia?
Yes, I do encounter that. And not only that, it's post-Soviet Central Asia and Russia. Makes no sense, right? Russia has its own category, and then the post-Soviets have their own category. And I think it's especially expected when it's not just the study of Central Asia, but let's say Central Asia and the South Caucasus, or the South Caucasus and Ukraine. So the post-Soviet shortcut is much preferred and sometimes is in the description for grants or whatever. Nobody wants to have, let's say, a journal article titled Central Asia and South Caucasus and, let's say, Eastern Europe or Europe, right? So if we consider Ukraine to be Europe, not just Eastern Europe, but Europe, so it becomes mouthful. And it's much easier to say just post-Soviet, that it's kind of snappy, short, as long as this post-Soviet does not necessarily include Russia. Because if it includes Russia, it's not just post-Soviet, it's Russia as well. So, yeah, there is this expectation, and we need to push back against it. We need to say that you can't be, as academics and as journalists, as activists, we should say, no, it's this terminology is no longer relevant, just like you can't say post-Columbus or post-British, post-Belgian or German or post whatever other empires that we know of from the most recent history or from the 20th century history. We don't say post-Mongol. So there's so many posts that we don't use, but post-Soviet somehow is still very sticky and people like it. And I think the general community of grant issuers and publishers like it because it's short and because they kind of like Soviet regime. They think that all the houses and ballet houses, opera and ballet houses and circuses actually did good things and were real art. And I disagree with
that. I actually have a working theory about that. I haven't received any grant to research it, so you can obviously question everything I say. But my working theory is that the West never actually Orientalized Central Asia, they Orientalized Russia. And through Orientalizing Russia, they Orientalized the post-Soviet space. So everything that is under Russian domination, but it's not Russia, is kind of this hybrid of something Russian, like Russian speaking, looking a little bit like Russia, but a little bit Oriental. But because people still cannot picture what Central Asia looks like, and it just doesn't exist in the common, understanding. It's like a white space on the map, a region between China, Afghanistan, Russia, and whatever, and like Europe. So people are kind of trying to find those shortcuts and those like mental images that they can apply to this region, and that's why they continue using post-Soviet. Whereas what is happening right now, and this is also something that I really don't like, is that Central Asia is trying to self-orientalize for the Western eye. So I don't know if you see like Uzbekistan and all the ads promoting Uzbekistan. They are so self-orientalizing. Like this image that is being, presented to the West has nothing to do with the truth. Obviously, we know that there is Samarkand, there is Bukhara, there is Khiva. They do look in a certain way, but Central Asia actually looks much more post-Soviet than what can be judged from those little videos that are presented to, I don't know, whatever, like tourist agencies. So do you think maybe that this is like part of this larger conversation that we are actually still trying to find out some clues and some shortcuts that we could give to foreigners, to like people in the West, in order for them to understand what this region is all about?
Right. Okay. So there's so much to unpack with that. So I completely agree that the West orientalized Russia. At the same time, after the Soviet Union's disintegration, I think a lot of policymakers and academics in the West tried to see Russia as a normal country. tried to take it as a normal country with normal politics. And that's why we have so much sympathy with the suffering Russians today, right? As opposed to, let's say, we kind of see, well, Ukrainians are suffering, but Russians are also suffering. This kind of discussions, which are unfortunate. Now, when it comes to promoting Central Asian countries abroad, it is really it's really different. The outward image projection is very different from the inward image projection, and that's normal. You want to present yourself abroad as exotic, and so it's you kind of amplify and glamorize your history, your artifacts for the external gaze, especially European gaze, that are looking for this kind of extreme experiences. You can see that happen with promotion of tourism in India or Malaysia or some African countries or Latin American countries. That's a normal thing that you amplify and you self-objectify yourself for their external gaze. Unfortunately so, right? But I think what we see happening domestically outside of the external gaze, but the discussions that have happening on the ground are really rich in saying, is decolonial thinking all about going back to the roots and seeing how we actually leave the native ways of living and, I don't know, cooking and attire that was repressed and erased by the Soviet regime? Or is it really being in this modern space and influenced by the Korean beauty? I'm sorry, going back to the Korean.
I just got my new Korean cream yesterday, and I think it's amazing. So yeah,
I agree.
I'm under its charm as
Whatever
well.
Korea is doing, it's just and we can have so many podcasts on that, right? So basically, like looking for the genuine self outside of external hegemonic narratives. What is us? And that's an important search that a lot of Central Asians, especially in those more intellectual activist communities, are going through proactively. What does it mean to be us outside of the civilizational narratives, outside of the external gaze? There's so many blending of what has been erased versus what are we bringing today based on this globalized influences. Who are we? What is our pathway? So the blending and the emergence of something new out of it seems like the genuine development that is happening across Central Asian cities and rural areas. And that's very similar to the discussions I've seen among feminist communities in India, for instance. What is an Indian woman? What is a liberated Indian woman? Is it a woman who will go into her traditions as she wants, or is that a woman who is wearing miniskirt and therefore kind of going with more Western ideals of an emancipated woman? So those discussions are important, and it doesn't mean that there is just one way of doing it, but there is the possibility of options is what creates genuine being, I think, as opposed to what we had during the Soviet period, that in order to be a Soviet woman or a Soviet person, there's this attributes. You speak Russian, you dress up certain way, you hold on by the party line, and so on and so forth. So it's an interesting development that happens within Central Asia. Now, the outside projection of image is different, and it's very market driven, to be honest. It's not just because Uzbekistanis feel that way about themselves, that, they ride camels and drink tea nonstop, right? It's something that catering to the outside market, and it's really market driven, I think. And we need to separate those different levels of self-presentation.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think the World's Nomad Games is another example. I saw it twice, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever do that again, because the amount of theater and people playing a role of being a nation is just it's a little bit too much for me. But I do understand why it appeals to Westerners, why it appeals to people. It's obviously very visually spectacular. So if anyone has a chance to see World's Nomad Games, I really encourage you to do so. But to me, the level of fakeness, let's say, is a little bit too much to swallow. But I wanted to ask you about the political dimension as well, because we know that what the Soviet Union left in Central Asia was clearly authoritarianism, right? It was one of the things. And the structures, the political structures that were built during the Soviet Union, this includes obviously the KGB, right? Or, all the elements of oppressive system of the law enforcement agencies and so on. And right now what we see is that on the one hand, Kazakhstan, for example, had this constitutional reform in which bicameral parliament became suddenly a Kurultai, and also links to the Golden Horde are being increasingly emphasized as part of Kazakhstan's history. So on the one hand, we do have this return to past structures, at least in the name, but at the same time, I kind of have a feeling that those oppressive structures of the authoritarian state that were set up by the Soviet Union and then, continued during independence, they are still intact. What do you think? Can we speak of a post-Soviet system in this sense?
Yes and no. Yes, you're right that especially the security apparatus, not just KGB, but law enforcement, the armies, that the Soviet Union left really, created conditions for the emergence of strong centralized power that had very good penetration in the society as well. So really good control of the society. And in my own research, I show that in the 1990s, when everything else collapsed, utilities, schooling, food supplies, agriculture, the security apparatus was able to preserve itself, especially law enforcement, the police, because they took bribes from the society. So they were self-funded enterprises, right, across Central Asia. And it obviously helps incumbents even when they are elected democratically. And I showed that on the example of Ukraine or even Georgia. Even when political incumbents elected democratically in competitive elections and promise democracy, it's just too easy to, again, rely on corrupt law enforcement that will police their opponents and repress mobilization, all that stuff. So there is that legacy that continues for sure. At the same time, the brand of autocratic governance that each Central Asian country today has built is really different from one another. Each autocrat has its own history of becoming such. Some are dynasties like Turkmenistan and possibly Tajikistan, and others are like Kyrgyzstan is the more extreme example of many, many experiments with open political system, and now we see this illiberal leader in power. So in that sense, I don't really see anything post-Soviet here. I see that just what we see across the world happening between intentions or between the interests of political elites to hold on to power, either through dynasty or through corruption, manipulation of constitutional order, and then the society's resistance to that or acceptance of it. And we see similar dynamics in Africa, in Latin America. And may I even say that the discussions of and studies of nepotism, election manipulation, corruption, tribal politics that we have extracted from Central Asian countries and other parts of the world as well are now so applicable in the United States as well. So the mechanisms behind corrupt politics we can see here in the United States as well. Can we call United States as post-Soviet? Obviously not. So those are just global processes that we see playing out across different continents. and Central Asia as well.
So to sum up, what is the best way to talk about the region and what could we replace the post-Soviet label with? Because sometimes we do want to talk about countries where it's still possible to communicate in Russian, even though some of them don't want to use this language, where the architecture still is similar because it was built during the Soviet times, and that once were dependent on Russia politically and socially, economically. So what would be an alternative label for this area?
So very often the replacement is Eurasia. And I don't like that either, because there is nothing, some Kazakh activists would say there is nothing European about what we're doing. We're Asian and we are fine with it. Why do you need to add Europe into the title when describing Kazakhstan? Similarly, Ukrainians would find it strange. Like, what's that part about Asia? When you talk about Ukraine, why are you including us into Eurasia? And, I also don't like that terminology. It has too close of an association with Dugin in Russia that he calls Eurasia, and that kind of also signals belonging to Russian sphere of interest. So honestly, I would go ahead and say it's Central Asia, South Caucasus, Ukraine, Moldova, whatever, Balkan states. Just name them, and that's okay. Just like you would name, if you study comparatively, India, South Africa, or I don't know, Nigeria, United States, what else? So you would call them by their names as opposed to applying a shorthand that is no longer relevant and makes no sense to the very countries that you study. Just make it a mouthful and make it a habit. I don't think there's any problem with that. More so, I now say increasingly Central Asia and North Asia when I study republics currently within Russia that are in North Asia. Because they're not Russia, they don't identify themselves as ethnic Russians or even see themselves as fully belonging or fully able to exercise their agency within Russia as citizens of Russia, the state of Russia. So I labeled them as North Asia. Yeah, and it's okay. It's okay to have long string of countries and set of countries, regions spelled out together, as opposed to using shorthands. So, Central Asia, South Caucasus, Central Asia, Mongolia, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Azerbaijan, Ukraine, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan. Fair game. It's okay, and let's just get used to it. It will add more nuance, better understanding, show that we are actually studying 21st century developments as opposed to being stuck in mid-20th century.
Thank you so much, Erica. This was a fascinating conversation. Thank you so much, and all the best to you.
Thank you so much, Agnieszka. Always nice chatting with you, and I love your podcast. It's really incredible job that you're doing and bringing so many different voices. Thank you.
Thank you. That's it for today. Thank you for listening, and please subscribe to Turan Tales on Substack. I look forward to meeting you there and on my newsletter's social media.